Robert Morrison, one of America's toughest prosecutors, had leveled the accusation at Ozzy Osbourne in the biggest case of his career. "You are an enemy of social order." But the defense that followed that accusation would bring everyone in the courtroom to their feet and change the course of artistic freedom. Debates in America, because sometimes the most powerful truths emerge from the most unexpected sources. The autumn of 1989 found the United States embroiled in what would become known as the Culture Wars, a series of heated debates about the boundaries of artistic expression, moral standards, and the role of government in regulating creative content. At the center of this storm was a legal case that would test the very foundations of the First Amendment. The case of State of California versus John Michael Osbourne had its origins in a tragedy that occurred 6 months earlier in the small town of Bakersfield, California. 17-year-old Michael Thompson had taken his own life after what his parents claimed was prolonged exposure to Ozzy Osbourne's music, particularly the song Suicide Solution. The Thompson family, supported by several conservative advocacy groups, filed a wrongful death lawsuit claiming that Ozzy's music had directly caused their son's suicide. What started as a civil lawsuit had evolved into something much larger, a criminal case in which the state was attempting to prove that Ozzy Osbourne's music constituted a clear and present danger to public safety. If successful, the prosecution could set a precedent that would fundamentally alter how artistic expression was regulated in America. The lead prosecutor assigned to the case was Robert Morrison, a veteran attorney with a reputation for taking on high-profile cases that involved moral and social issues. Morrison had built his career prosecuting cases involving obscenity, public corruption, and crimes against children. His appointment to this case signaled that the state was treating it with the utmost seriousness. Morrison was known for his methodical approach to prosecution and his ability to present complex, legal arguments in terms that juries could easily understand. He had never lost a case that he personally prosecuted, and his conviction rate had made him one of the most feared prosecutors in California. For him, the Ozzy Osbourne case represented the culmination of his life's work, a chance to strike a decisive blow against what he saw as the corruption of American youth. The defense team, led by attorney Susan Fletcher, faced an uphill battle from the start. Fletcher was a seasoned civil rights attorney who had built her reputation defending unpopular causes and controversial clients. She understood that this case was about much more than one musician's career. It was about the fundamental right of artists to express themselves without government interference. The Los Angeles Superior Court had been chosen as the venue for the trial, partly because of its proximity to the entertainment industry, and partly because of its reputation for handling high-profile cases with appropriate security and media management. Judge William Patterson, a moderate Republican with 20 years on the bench, was assigned to preside over what everyone knew would be a closely watched proceeding. The courtroom itself became a symbol of the cultural divide that the case represented. On one side sat the prosecution's supporters, parents groups, religious leaders, and conservative activists who saw the trial as a crucial battle for the soul of American culture. On the other side were Ozzy's supporters, musicians, civil liberties advocates, and young people who viewed the prosecution as an attack on their right to choose their own entertainment. The media attention was unprecedented for a case involving a musician. Major television networks provided live coverage of key proceedings, and newspapers across the country carried daily updates on the trial's progress. The case had become a lightning rod for broader cultural tensions, with both sides treating it as a referendum on American values. Jury selection took 3 weeks, as both sides sought to identify jurors who could fairly evaluate the evidence despite the intense publicity surrounding the case. The final jury consisted of 12 individuals ranging in age from 23 to 67, representing a cross-section of California society. Several were parents, some were college-educated professionals, and others came from working-class backgrounds. As the trial began, it became clear that this would be unlike any legal proceeding most observers had ever witnessed. The prosecution's case would rely heavily on expert testimony about the psychological effects of music on young people, while the defense planned to argue that artistic expression could not be held responsible for individual actions. Robert Morrison's opening statement set the tone for what would become one of the most controversial prosecutions in American legal history. Standing before the jury in his characteristic navy blue suit, Morrison presented himself as a defender of society's most vulnerable members, its children. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Morrison began, his voice carrying the authority that had made him successful in hundreds of previous cases. We are here today because a 17-year-old boy named Michael Thompson is dead. He died by his own hand, but he did not die alone. He died while listening to music that told him death was preferable to life, that suicide was a solution to his problems. Morrison walked slowly in front of the jury box, making eye contact with each juror as he continued his argument. The defendant, John Michael Osbourne, known professionally as Ozzy Osbourne, has built a career on promoting death, darkness, and despair. His music glorifies suicide, celebrates violence, and encourages young people to reject the values that hold our society together. The prosecutor's strategy was clear from the beginning. He would argue that Ozzy's music was not protected speech under the First Amendment because it posed a clear and present danger to public safety. This was a legal standard that had been used in previous cases to restrict speech that could lead to imminent lawless action. This is not about censorship, Morrison continued, anticipating the defense's arguments. This is about responsibility. When someone uses their platform to encourage destructive behavior, especially among impressionable young people, they must be held accountable for the consequences of their actions. Morrison then presented what he considered his strongest evidence, a detailed analysis of Ozzy's lyrics, performed by Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychologist who specialized in the effects of media on adolescent behavior. Dr. Williams had prepared a comprehensive report that argued Ozzy's music contained subliminal messages designed to promote suicidal thoughts. Dr. Williams will testify that the defendant's song Suicide Solution contains backward masked messages that can only be heard when the record is played in reverse, Morrison explained. These messages, combined with the explicit lyrical content, create a psychological environment that can trigger suicidal behavior in vulnerable individuals. The prosecutor spent considerable time establishing the timeline of Michael Thompson's exposure to Ozzy's music and his subsequent decline in mental health. He presented testimony from the teenager's parents, teachers, and friends, all of whom described a dramatic change in Michael's behavior after he began listening to heavy metal music. Michael Thompson was a normal, healthy teenager until he fell under the influence of the defendant's music. Morrison argued, within 6 months of discovering Ozzy Osbourne, he had withdrawn from his family, his grades had plummeted, and he had begun exhibiting signs of severe depression. The connection is clear and undeniable. Over the course of 2 weeks, Morrison methodically built his case against Ozzy Osbourne. He called a parade of expert witnesses who testified about the potential harmful effects of heavy metal music on young people. Dr. Williams, the psychologist, presented her analysis of what she called subliminal suicide messages in Ozzy's recordings. When played backwards, certain portions of Suicide Solution contain phrases like, "Why try to live?" and "Get the gun." Dr. Williams testified, these messages, while not consciously perceived by listeners, can influence behavior at a subconscious level. The prosecution also called Dr. Marcus Reed, a psychiatrist who had treated several teenagers for what he described as heavy metal-induced depression. Reed testified that he had observed a pattern of behavioral changes in young people who listened to aggressive music, including increased hostility, social withdrawal, and suicidal ideation. Heavy metal music, particularly the type performed by Mr. Osbourne, creates a psychological environment that can be extremely harmful to developing minds, Dr. Reed testified. The combination of aggressive musical arrangements, dark lyrical content, and performative elements that glorify death and destruction can push vulnerable individuals towards self-destructive behavior. Morrison also presented evidence about Ozzy's stage performances, using video footage and photographs to argue that his concerts promoted violence and antisocial behavior. The prosecution showed clips of Ozzy biting the head off a bat during a performance, arguing that such actions normalized extreme and disturbing behavior. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison said while showing the footage, "this is what the defendant considers entertainment. This is what he presents to audiences, filled with teenagers and young adults. How can we be surprised when young people who idolize this behavior begin to act out in destructive ways?" The most emotionally powerful moment of the prosecution's case came when Michael Thompson's parents testified about their son's final months. His mother, Sarah Thompson, broke down in tears as she described finding her son's body in his bedroom, surrounded by Ozzy Osbourne albums and posters. "He wasn't the same boy after he started listening to that music," she sobbed. "He became angry, withdrawn, and obsessed with death. We tried to help him, but it was like he was under some kind of spell." Michael's father, Robert Thompson, Morrison Sr. was more composed but equally compelling in his testimony. "My son was a good kid who made good grades and had a bright future ahead of him," he said. "That music poisoned his mind and convinced him that life wasn't worth living." Susan Fletcher's defense strategy was built around two fundamental arguments. First, that artistic expression, no matter how controversial, was protected by the First Amendment, and second, that individual actions could not be attributed to external influences like music or other forms of entertainment. Fletcher had spent months preparing for this case, consulting with constitutional law experts, musicologists, and mental health professionals. She understood that she needed to present a defense that was both legally sound and emotionally compelling, given the tragic circumstances that had led to the trial. Her opening statement focused on the broader implications of the prosecution's case. "Ladies and gentlemen, this trial is not really about Ozzy Osbourne or even about the tragic death of Michael Thompson," Fletcher began. "This trial is about whether we, as a society, are willing to sacrifice our fundamental freedoms in response to tragedy." Fletcher argued that the prosecution's case was based on a dangerous precedent that could be used to restrict any form of artistic expression that someone found objectionable. "If we accept the argument that music can be held legally responsible for individual actions, where does it end?" she asked. "Do we ban books that contain violent scenes? Do we prosecute filmmakers whose movies depict suicide? Do we hold poets responsible if someone is inspired by their work to commit a crime?" The defense attorney also challenged the scientific validity of the prosecution's expert witnesses. She pointed out that the concept of backward masking had been thoroughly debunked by mainstream psychology and that there was no credible evidence supporting the idea that subliminal messages in music could influence behavior. "The prosecution wants you to believe in a form of mind control that exists only in science fiction," Fletcher argued. "They want you to believe that simply listening to a song can override a person's free will and force them to take their own life. This is not science, this is superstition." Fletcher's most important strategic decision was to call Ozzy himself as a witness. This was risky, as it would expose him to cross-examination by Morrison, but Fletcher believed that allowing the jury to hear directly from Ozzy about his music and his intentions was crucial to the defense. The courtroom was packed to capacity on the day Ozzy Osbourne was scheduled to testify. Media representatives filled the press section, sketch artists positioned themselves for the best views, and members of the public who had waited in line for hours packed the gallery. Ozzy walked to the witness stand wearing a conservative dark suit, his usually wild hair neatly combed. The transformation from his stage persona to this subdued courtroom appearance was striking, and several jurors seemed surprised by his ordinary, almost humble demeanor. Fletcher's direct examination was carefully structured to humanize Ozzy and to explain his artistic process. She began by asking him about his background, his childhood in Birmingham, and his early struggles with poverty and learning disabilities. "Mr. Osbourne," Fletcher asked, "can you tell the jury about your upbringing and how it influenced your music?" "I grew up in a working-class family in Birmingham, England," Ozzy replied, his voice quiet but clear. "My father worked in a factory, and we didn't have much money. I struggled in school because of dyslexia, and I often felt like an outsider. Music became my way of expressing feelings I couldn't put into words." Fletcher then asked him to explain the meaning behind Suicide Solution, the song at the center of the prosecution's case. Ozzy's explanation was thoughtful and detailed, describing how the song was actually written as a warning about the dangers of alcoholism, not as an encouragement to suicide. "The song is about alcohol being a false solution to problems," Ozzy explained. "It's about how drinking can seem like an escape, but it actually makes things worse. The title is ironic. Suicide isn't a solution at all." When Fletcher asked about his stage performances and the controversial elements that the prosecution had highlighted, Ozzy provided context that the prosecution had ignored. "The theatrical elements of my shows are meant to be obviously fake and exaggerated," he said. "It's performance art, like a horror movie. The audience understands that it's not real." Robert Morrison's cross-examination of Ozzy was aggressive and confrontational, designed to break down the sympathetic image that Fletcher had worked to create. Morrison was at his most formidable, using his years of courtroom experience to try to trap Ozzy in contradictions or admissions that would support the prosecution's case. "Mr. Osbourne," Morrison began, his tone sharp and accusatory, "you've testified that your music is intended as entertainment. But isn't it true that you've built your career on shocking and disturbing imagery?" "I've always been honest about what my music is," Ozzy replied. "It's not for everyone, and I've never claimed otherwise." Morrison pressed harder. "But you must admit that young people look up to you as a role model. Don't you feel any responsibility for how your music might influence their behavior?" This question struck at the heart of the prosecution's case, and Ozzy's response would be crucial. He paused for a moment, seemingly gathering his thoughts, before providing an answer that surprised everyone in the courtroom. "Mr. Morrison," Ozzy said, his voice growing stronger, "you want to hold me responsible for a teenager's suicide. But where were you when that boy needed help? Where was the mental health support? Where was the intervention from his school, his community, his family?" The courtroom stirred as Ozzy continued, his emotional intensity building. "I've received thousands of letters from young people who say my music helped them through difficult times, who say it made them feel less alone. But you don't want to talk about those letters, do you?" Morrison tried to interrupt, but Judge Patterson allowed Ozzy to continue. "You want a simple answer to a complex problem," Ozzy said, now speaking directly to the prosecutor. "You want to blame music instead of addressing the real issues: poverty, abuse, mental illness, social isolation. It's easier to scapegoat an artist than to fix the problems that actually cause young people to suffer." What happened next was unprecedented in Morrison's long career as a prosecutor. Instead of sitting back down, Ozzy remained standing and addressed the entire courtroom, his voice carrying the passion and authenticity that had made him a compelling performer. "I want to say something to the parents in this courtroom," Ozzy said, looking directly at Michael Thompson's family. "I am deeply sorry for your loss. No parent should have to endure what you've endured. But blaming my music won't bring your son back, and it won't prevent other tragedies." He turned to face the jury. "I grew up poor, struggling with learning disabilities, feeling like I didn't belong anywhere. Music saved my life. It gave me a way to express pain and anger and confusion that I couldn't express any other way. And I know there are millions of young people who feel the same way." The emotion in Ozzy's voice was genuine and powerful. "My music comes from real experience, from struggle, from pain, from the feeling of being an outsider. If we're going to start prosecuting artists for expressing those experiences, then we're not just attacking music, we're attacking the right of people to tell their stories." By this point, several people in the gallery were openly weeping, moved by the raw honesty of Ozzy's words. Even some of the jurors appeared emotional. "Mr. Morrison wants you to believe that I'm dangerous," Ozzy continued. "But the real danger is the idea that we can solve complex social problems by silencing the people who dare to talk about them. The real danger is thinking that we can protect young people by hiding the truth about life's difficulties." Judge Patterson, realizing that the proceeding had moved far beyond a typical cross-examination, allowed Ozzy to continue. "I've spent my entire career singing about the things that hurt people: depression, addiction, alienation, despair. I sing about these things because they're real, and because pretending they don't exist doesn't make them go away. Sometimes the only way to deal with darkness is to acknowledge it, to name it, to bring it into the light." Ozzy's voice cracked with emotion as he reached his conclusion. "If my music has helped even one person feel less alone in their struggle, then it's been worth everything. And if this trial results in artists being afraid to tell the truth about the human experience, then we'll all be poorer for it." When Ozzy finally sat down, the courtroom was silent for a long moment. Then, spontaneously, a few people in the gallery began to applaud. The applause spread throughout the courtroom until nearly everyone was standing and clapping, including several of the jurors. Judge Patterson made no attempt to stop the demonstration, perhaps recognizing that he had just witnessed something extraordinary, a moment when art, law, and human emotion had intersected in a way that transcended the usual boundaries of courtroom procedure. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before reaching their verdict. When they returned to the courtroom, the foreman announced that they had found Ozzy Osbourne not guilty of all charges. But more than that, several jurors later said that they had been deeply moved by his testimony and convinced that the prosecution had been fundamentally wrong in its approach. In post-trial interviews, juror Maria Rodriguez said, "We all felt terrible about the Thompson family's loss, but we couldn't hold one man responsible for such a complex tragedy. Mr. Osbourne's testimony helped us understand that music is about expression, not instruction. Another juror, retired teacher James Mitchell, added, "What convinced me was when he talked about helping people feel less alone. That's what good art does. It helps us understand that our struggles are shared, that we're not isolated in our pain." The verdict was seen as a landmark victory for artistic freedom and First Amendment rights. Constitutional law experts praised the decision as an important precedent that would protect artists from being held legally responsible for the actions of their audience members. Robert Morrison, in a rare moment of public reflection after the trial, acknowledged that the case had taught him something important about the complexity of social issues. "I still believe we need to protect young people," he said, "but I've come to understand that censorship isn't the answer. We need better mental health services, stronger communities, and more support for families in crisis." The state of California versus John Michael Osbourne case became a foundational precedent in American law regarding artistic expression and social responsibility. Law schools began teaching the case as an example of how constitutional principles could be tested under extreme circumstances. More broadly, the trial marked a turning point in the culture wars of the 1980s and 1990s. While debates about music, violence, and social values continued, the legal precedent established by Ozzy's acquittal made it much more difficult for prosecutors to pursue similar cases against artists. The case also had a profound impact on how mental health issues were discussed in relation to youth culture. Rather than blaming external influences like music or media, mental health professionals increasingly focused on providing better support systems and intervention programs for at-risk young people. For Ozzy himself, the trial represented a personal transformation as much as a legal victory. He began speaking more openly about mental health issues and became an advocate for better understanding of the challenges faced by young people struggling with depression and other mental health conditions. Susan Fletcher, the defense attorney, later wrote a book about the case titled Defending the Dark: How One Trial Changed American Law. In it, she reflected on the broader implications of the verdict. The Osbourne case established that artists cannot be held responsible for how their work is interpreted or misinterpreted by individual audience members. This principle is essential to maintaining a free and open society. The prosecution of Ozzy Osbourne represented one of the most significant challenges to artistic freedom in American legal history. Robert Morrison's accusation that Ozzy was an enemy of social order was ultimately rejected, not just by the jury, but by a society that came to understand that protecting free expression, even controversial expression, was essential to maintaining democratic values. Ozzy's response in that Los Angeles courtroom, his passionate defense of artistic honesty, and his compassionate acknowledgement of human suffering, became one of the most powerful statements about the role of art in society ever delivered in a legal setting. His words reminded everyone present that artists serve an important function in helping people process difficult emotions and experiences. The case demonstrated that the American legal system, despite its imperfections, was capable of recognizing the difference between artistic expression and criminal incitement. It established important precedents that continue to protect artists today from being held legally responsible for the actions of their audience members. Perhaps most importantly, the trial showed that even in times of moral panic and social tension, reasoned argument and heartfelt testimony could prevail over fear and prejudice. Ozzy's victory was not just a personal triumph, but a victory for everyone who believes that art should be free to explore the full range of human experience, including its darkest corners. The courtroom that day witnessed more than just a legal proceeding. It witnessed a moment when art defended itself with eloquence and truth, and when a society chose freedom over fear. That moment continues to resonate today, reminding us that the price of artistic freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would silence voices that make them uncomfortable. Robert Morrison's prediction that Ozzy Osbourne was dangerous to society proved ironically accurate, but not in the way the prosecutor intended. Ozzy was dangerous to a society that preferred comfortable lies to difficult truths, that chose scapegoating over understanding, and that was willing to sacrifice fundamental rights in pursuit of simple answers to complex problems. In that sense, his danger to such a society was exactly what America needed.